It is August 27, 1896, and the British Empire has just declared war on Zanzibar. The British Empire is the world's foremost naval power, with a navy that spans the globe. Zanzibar, on the other hand, has a navy of 2 gunboats and a couple of steam launches. And yet they almost won an entire war in less than an hour. How? Why? Let's find out. This is the shortest war in history. Our story begins in 1890 when the British gained control over Zanzibar. Following a series of treaties and shrewd negotiations, the Sultanate of Zanzibar was particularly wealthy thanks to cloves, ivory, and, of course, slaves. In fact, at this time Zanzibar was one of the largest slave markets in the entire world. Great Britain hated slavery, so when they took control over Zanzibar, they also committed to abolishing slavery there. This made them very popular with many Zanzibaris, but not with everyone. The Sultan at the time, Hamud bin Muhammad, was particularly unhappy. You see, the Sultan had grown up in a different time where slavery was commonplace and even encouraged, and by getting rid of slavery, he felt that he was losing part of his power and wealth. He wasn't ready to give that up so easily. Tensions were high as the British began to dismantle the slave trade, but nothing came of it. Then, in 1896, the Sultan died. His successor would be Khalid bin Bargash, who had studied in England and was sympathetic to the British cause. Once again, it seemed like everything would be fine, but Khalif was soon influenced by another faction within Zanzibar society, the Wahi, a religious sect that had been persecuted for their beliefs, and were now using any means necessary to get back at the British. Khalifa bin Bargash sided with them and immediately began rearming the island's defenses and creating alliances with neighboring African states. It didn't take long before the British found out about this. Now, this wasn't the first time that Britain had put down a rebellion in one of their colonies. Usually, they would send in troops and then arrest the leaders and anyone else that they could get their hands on. But they didn't want to do that here. You see, Zanzibar was more than just a colony to the British. They needed it as a strategic trading post along the important sea route to India. If they sent in troops, they would likely have to fight through the city, damaging much of the infrastructure that they relied upon. Instead, they decided to blockade the island and wait for the Sultan to come to his senses. But that plan failed. When the Sultan refused to surrender, the British had no choice but to invade. On August 25, 1896, British warships arrived off the coast of Zanzibar. They fired warning shots into the air and demanded that the Sultan surrender or face the consequences. The British thought this would be enough. The Sultan, after all, didn't have a navy to speak of, only a couple of small gunboats and some old steam launches. But he had something that the British didn't. Soon, dozens of small boats filled with African soldiers and armed civilians began pouring out of the harbor and surrounding the British ships. From the British perspective, things were looking bad. They had vastly underestimated their enemy and were now being attacked from all sides. But little did they know that their biggest challenge was still to come. The British opened fire and drove away most of the small craft, but a few managed to close in and get off a shot. One of those shots hit the HMS St. George, killing 1 sailor and wounding several others. This enraged the British. Now they weren't just fighting to subdue a rebellion, they were fighting to avenge the death of one of their own. The captain of the St. George ordered all available guns to be turned on the nearest Zanzibari ship, the 25-year-old HMS Nyanj, which was armed with a single 6-inch gun. The British ships bombarded the Nyanj for several minutes until it finally blew up. The other Zanzibari ships scattered, but now the British faced a new problem. The dead and wounded sailors needed medical attention, and fast. There were 5 ships present at the bombardment, each equipped with a surgeon, but none of them had any facilities to treat this many patients. The Royal Navy had never anticipated having to deal with anything more than a quick, decisive engagement with a few small boats, and so they were woefully unprepared for what had actually happened. That's why they called for help. They sent out flares to alert passing ships to come in and help, then organized the wounded onto the shore. Meanwhile, the Sultan was furious. He had hoped that the British wouldn't dare attack him directly and would instead come to negotiate. When that didn't happen, he attempted to flee to Dar-es-Salaam in mainland Africa. But on the way, he stopped at the British consulate to try to negotiate. Unfortunately for him, the consulate was empty. Everyone had fled at the first sign of trouble. Dejected, the Sultan returned to his palace, where he waited for the inevitable. By this point, the British had landed a force of 500 men and were marching on the Sultan's palace. But they had barely moved 500 yards when they heard a voice over the radio. It was the Sultan's. It was August 27, 1896, just 38 minutes after the start of the conflict. The British couldn't believe their luck. They had defeated the Zanzibari in less than an hour without suffering any serious casualties. The Sultan was arrested and taken to a ship for trial. The rest of the Zanzibari leadership met the same fate, and soon after, Zanzibar was under full British control. But not everyone was happy with the outcome. Many of the local African population blamed the British for the violence. They believed that if the British hadn't provoked the Sultan, none of this would have ever happened. The British, on the other hand, blamed the Sultan for being irrational and starting the conflict in the first place. Each side had their own perspective, but in reality, both were guilty of one major mistake: underestimating their enemy. You see, the British had seriously underestimated the Zanzibari. They thought that they would be able to take the island with just 500 men, but they were wrong. The Zanzibari had put up one of the fiercest defenses in history, and nearly won the war despite being completely outgunned. On the other hand, the Sultan had also underestimated the British. He knew that they had a navy, but he didn't realize how powerful it really was. He thought that he could hold them off long enough for his allies to arrive and save the day. But he was wrong. The British ships were too powerful and had overwhelmed the Zanzibari in less than an hour. In the end, the Anglo-Zanzibar War lasted just 38 minutes, making it the shortest war in recorded history. And yet at Essaouira, that could have been avoided entirely. If the British and the Sultan had just sat down and talked, unfortunately, they didn't. And instead, we got the weirdest war in history. So, what do you think? Did the British act right in invading Zanzibar, or was it wrong to use force to stop the Sultan? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you next time.